There's significant discussion surrounding Iraqi armed groups and their impact on the region, specifically in relation to Israel and Western Kurdistan. Amid the growing tension in the Middle East, heightened by the conflict between Hamas and Israel, groups identifying as the Islamic Resistance have carried out repeated attacks within Israel territory. To explore this topic further, we are joined by Ms. Irina Zuckerman, a national security researcher live from New York. Ms. Zuckerman, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Let me begin by asking, what is the impact of presence of armed groups in Iraq on Iraqis' diplomatic relations with the Western countries?
It significantly complicates this relationship. One of the most practical impacts, of course, from the security side is the disruption to the planned Iraq-Turkey development corridor, which was supposed to allow the transport of goods um, between the countries and stimulate economic activity in the region, contribute to peaceful trade patterns in the region. But because of the activities by Iran-backed militias, which are not under the control of the government, nothing has come to pass so far. They've taken significant control in the areas where some of this corridor activity is supposed to originate, and because of that, the flow of trade is disrupted, and so far nothing has started. And that's just one example. Another broader example is general investment activity. One of the major risks for global investors, especially from Western countries, of course, but also from the region, is the concerns about potential attacks, whether on pipelines, whether on infrastructure projects, educational projects, or any sort of technical activity. The possibility of lawlessness and intervention has limited the entry of neighboring countries into the Iraqi markets.
Ms. Zuckerman, how do these armed groups influence Iraq's political landscape and government decision making?
Well, quite frankly, they're holding the government hostage to some extent. They represent a significant enough segment of the population that they cannot simply be ignored. They are armed, so disarming them would take a very significant and organized force, and government resources are not sufficient to deal with that. Another problem is political. They have the backing of Iran, and there is a concern about upheaval if in the event that the government tries to integrate them by force. Besides that, there are elements of the government that are very close to the Iranian political circles, and therefore they prefer this state within a state situation, because these militias also represent their own thinking. So we're dealing with a complicated situation where the government is uh, too sectarian in itself and too weak and not centralized enough in certain ways to deal with these militias. But on the other hand, it's also has not focused on this problem, instead focusing on economic issues with the Kurds, the political standoffs between the two of them, and not really focusing on the issue as the central security problem in Iraq.
To what extent has foreign interference in Iraq's political decision making contributed to the nation's instability?
Well, the thing is this: until the country is fully stabilized and at peace with its neighbors, there will always be some sort of foreign intervention, simply because if Iraq is partially a failed state or partially a disunited state, the security problems inside Iraq will impact the outside world, whether the neighboring the country's Western interests, the energy activity, and so forth. But for sure, Iran has been the primarily one of the primary intervening forces, so much so that it holds a permanent political hold inside Iraq. U.S. influence is actually coming to an end, as there has been a negotiated drawdown with only a minimal of forces remaining for security purposes, and even those might be withdrawn completely if Donald Trump decides to capitalize on the momentum of isolationism and withdraw all of these forces. So, on the one hand, you have this very negative intervention from on the Iran end. On the other hand, the Western powers have had enough of dealing with these issues and trying to refocus elsewhere, so, which leaves a vacuum of power, and that means that other powers will come in and capitalize on chaos, and we are seeing some of that already. Russia and China's interest in energy resources, for instance, created a presence for them. They are dealing with Iran on a very friendly and integrated level, so it means that Iran is opening the doors for them in Iraq. So Iraq is turning into a sphere of influence for various states.
While Iran has shown open support for armed groups within the Popular Mobilization Forces, the United States has issued threats to disband these groups. How do you think the Iraqi government under Mohammed Shia Sudani can balance these opposing pressures?
Well, US influence right now is very limited to keeping very basic security. Unless US is fully committed in extinguishing Iranian influence in Iraq and elsewhere in the region, it will inevitably fail to influence Iraq as much as Iran, which is physically close to it, which has invested into universities and madrasas in Iraq, which has devoted significant resources and de facto colonized Iraq, and also has a significant segment of a population that is backed and has been educated or partially educated in Iran with the help of Iranian instructors. So it's not an even calculus, and putting sanctions on some militias and providing a minimal presence and occasionally fighting with them is not the same as a very systematic, concerted effort um, to de-radicalize and dismantle militias and to ensure that the constitutional framework is fairly enforced. And we have seen that a lot of it has not actually been enforced since the new constitution was adopted back in the early 2000s. And we are seeing that increasingly elements of Iraqi politics are being taken over by outside forces, therefore, and militias are there to enforce the adaptation of these external policies, much more so than the US, which maintains a minimal presence focused mostly on guarding against ISIS interference with oil and gas or very direct militant activity in the region. Unless we look past counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism and look at the counter-extremism and encountering state actors being involved, dismantling militias will fail.
A U.S. House Representative, Mr. John Wilson, of the Head Foreign Affairs Committee, has announced plans to introduce a bill designating the Badr organization as a terrorist organization. If this bill passes the House of Representatives, how much pressure will it exert, and how effective could it be in dismantling these groups?
I think just calling someone a terrorist doesn't mean that they'll have any less popular support or that they'll be easily disarmed. There's been efforts to integrate the militias into the official military, to give them various opportunities to deal with them in various ways, but they all have failed unless there's a very systemic distancing from Iran on all levels, and unless there is a concerted push in all of the state institutions to counter the ideological support for these groups, nothing will come of this effort.
Regarding the relationship between these groups and Iran, as well as their alignment with Iran's agenda, are these groups genuinely as dangerous as militant organizations?
Yes, I think they're basically informal enforcers for Iran. Imagine having a rampant invasion, which is also somehow considered local. So these are local operatives. The Iraqis, they were born and raised in Iraq, but many of them have been educated abroad or educated through the Iranian system or sympathetic to a foreign state actor. So it's having a fifth column, a state within a state. It's destabilizing, it's sectarian, it turns people on each other, and it brings on radicalization, and it welcomes the opposite, um, extremism from other ideological streams. I think it's almost inevitable that allowing these groups to proliferate will contribute to the return of ISIS and similar factions from different other extreme ideologies.
I'd like to pivot to the issues of ISIS. Considering the changes in Syria and the reported influx of weapons into ISIS controlled groups, to what extent do you think ISIS could re emerge as a dominant force?
I think, of course, a lot will depend on the international community and how much push they will have to make sure that the provisional government in Syria takes measures to prevent the spread of radicalism and to instill tolerance and political safeguards against the rise of ideological extremism or against terrorist groups. But so far, this does not seem promising. HTS has yet to fully explain their alleged ideological shift from Al Qaeda affiliation to alleged multiculturalism or pluralistic attitude. They have given citizenship to a lot of foreign fighters who seem to have hardline ideologies. They have not yet um, been able to fully control the various armed groups that are running amok throughout the country and picking fights with Kurds and with other segments of the population. So I'm not entirely sure that HTS is able to control the security situation, much less instill the sort of authority that will prevent anything from happening. And it's entirely possible that if you have hardline pro-Islamist states like Turkey and Qatar funding this entire project, that it will inevitably become an attractive area for terrorist groups from all over the world, groups in Afghanistan, even Iraqi sympathizers can find can flock to the borders and seek to overwhelm and take advantage of the security vacuum to enter and to entrench themselves. So we can see there's a big possibility for quite a bit of chaos, which is why I think the international community should be very vigilant. It should be tightly controlling the economic situation, and it should not prematurely be lifting sanctions, and it should be very carefully watching what state actors are doing in the region and what policies they are adopting.
Thank you very much, Ms. Irina Zuckerman, national security researcher who was with us live from New York. Thank you for coming. We greatly appreciate your expertise and thank you for the time you've given us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.